Great, so welcome to another edition of a Ragged Theology podcast, and I'm delighted today to be joined by my good friend Catriona Murray, and by the wonders of modern technology, she's beaming all the way from North Tulster. So welcome, Catriona.
Hi, Andy. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me along.
It's always good to have another Murray on the podcast.
Absolutely not enough Murrays on the airwaves. I'm always saying that.
So we shouldn't have too many pauses with Catriona on. We should have plenty to talk about. First of all, Catriona, tell us a bit about yourself. You're a lecturer, you're a blogger, you're involved in the Stornoway Trust, you're a media star, so there's many strings to your bow. Do you want to just tell us a bit about your background, where you're from, and what you're doing at the moment?
Yeah, sure. I was born and brought up in Lewis. Brought up, and educated in Lewis, which not a lot of people can say. I was
Well educated.
Well educated, or well, I don't know, but the education was good enough. It's what I did with it is maybe the questionable part. But I lived in Lewis all my life and did my degree here in rural development through the University of the Highlands and Islands, who I now work for. I spent a few years working in community development first, and then joined the Gaelic department at Castle College, UHI, and I've been there for a scary amount of time. I think it's about 18 years now. So that takes up a fair bit of my time. And other than that, as you've mentioned, yes, I blog under Post Tenebris Lux, and a sort of a spin-off, if I can call it that, to the blog is the column I have in the Record, the Free Church's monthly magazine. And a member of the Free Church here in Stornoway as well. I've been a communicant member there for 5 years now. And over and above that, I think you mentioned I'm a Stornoway trustee, which is the local community landlord, and that's the most public thing that I do, I suppose. But that all when you bring all of that together, it fills up quite a lot of my time.
You must be a busy lady.
Yeah, it's something that's been challenging to try and sort of keep all those plates spinning. But actually, quite a lot of those things are complementary to one another. I find that my work with the Stornoway Trust complements the job that I do, and vice versa. And since lockdown, of course, with everything going online, it's a lot easier to manage because you're not actually physically rushing from class to meeting to class to meeting. You're staying in the one place, and in some ways you can actually fit a lot more in. And I think you have the time that you do spend on things, I feel like it's more quality time because you're not actually worrying about getting from A to B. The biggest worry you have is my internet link going to hold?
And on your blog, you describe yourself as a hybridian, a Christian, and a widow. So we'll chat about the widow later on. But I'm interested in your definition that you're a Hebridean. I frequently describe myself as a Highlander, but what for you does being a Hebridean mean to you?
Um, I think Islanders, as a general rule, have a quite strong sense of their own identity. And when I was trying to think of a strap line for the blog, I was trying to sum myself up in as few words as possible. And it's kind of subconscious. I think that's maybe the first word that I've used ahead of the other two. Um, I have a very strong sense of my Gaelic heritage, I suppose, and of just the unique worldview that Islanders have. I suppose, stereotypically we're thought of as being insular, because of course the word insular comes from the Latin for island, and by our very definition, we've got these very defined borders, and we do have a very strong sense of who we are. And living in an island community, there's this, you're part of an identified community. If you don't know everybody around you, you certainly know them on sight. You know they belong to the community. And that's quite, some people I think experience that as being quite a claustrophobic thing, but I've always experienced it as a positive, warm, quite a supportive thing. And, you mentioned about the fact that I'm a widow, and I think people who experience grief in a community like this experience it in maybe a different way to how it might manifest in other situations, because you have that closeness. You have, generally speaking, people will have their family, extended family, and then the wider community even almost functions as extended family at times. So to me, being Hebridean, it has all these positive connotations of warmth and community, and yeah, the Gaelic heritage, and a very strong sense of who you are and of your place in the world.
And just thinking about all these different things you're involved in, so there's not many bloggers around, um, and there's not many people who blog as prolifically as you. Um, there's not many people who are involved in something like the Stornoway Trust. Um, why is it that you do all this? Why do you blog, and why do you get involved in the Stornoway Trust? Some people would say, you know, why don't you just sit back and relax and chill out, take Mr. Roy for walks in Trivor? Why do you get involved in all these different things?
Yeah, it's something that, I mentioned earlier on about how lockdown has made things easier in terms of there being less sort of physical hustle bustle. And before that, a number of people, my family, close friends, had said to me, maybe you need to dial down on your activities a little bit, because they were saying just what you're saying, that how do you pack it all in, and it's a bit frantic and something's got to give. But since I made my public profession of faith, I always felt compelled, and I don't think it was a conscious thing. It was just a compulsion to have a voice, or to be a voice, I suppose. For initially, I think it started out when I was writing the blog. First of all, it was this feeling that culturally I belong to the Free Church, and it's been a huge cultural influence as well. And I was aware of that even before I was aware of being a Christian. And I always felt that the Free Church had been unfairly maligned by writers and by the media, and just by popular cultural representations, that somehow the church had destroyed traditional culture and that it was keeping the people down. And I had this kind of strong compulsion to speak out about that, because I always felt a bit frustrated. Even before I was a Christian, I used to feel frustrated that the church never opened its mouth to defend itself. I understand now why that is, but I always found it a bit frustrating. And because I'm not a minister, I'm not an elder, I'm not someone who holds office in the church, I actually have a certain amount of freedom in what I can say. So the blog was really the first sort of step into the public fray, if you like. Encouraged very much by yourself, I might add. So you can take the blame or the credit as delete as applicable. And things sort of snowballed from there. I think the Stornoway Trust is one of those things, similar to standing for council, or even for a community council, or various local committees. In order to be elected onto something like that, you have to have a profile in the first place. You can have all the ability in the world and lots to offer, but if people don't know who you are, they're not going to vote for you. And I had a profile because of the blog. The blog gained surprised me how much attention it got. But I think it was because people recognised in it that I was sort of articulating something that they were feeling. So I tapped into something. That was the kind of the commonest thing that was said to me by people who read the blog, especially in its early years. They would say, "How is it you've picked up exactly what I wanted to say? You've articulated what I feel, or you've articulated what we feel." So I think that's what that did. And I'm really glad about that, because that's kind of why I started it myself. I felt there was a lack of a voice coming from within this kind of community, from Christians who had, in recent years, they've been kind of marginalised and pushed to the boundaries and told to be quiet, and especially when it comes to public life. So when I stood for the Stornoway Trust, it was against my own better judgment to begin with. People suggested it to me, and I kind of laughed it off, and I said, no, I'm too busy and it's not for me. And then by the time I think 4 or 5 people had said it to me, I started to think, am I actually dismissing something here that the Lord is directing me towards? Am I, on my own will and on my own wisdom saying, no, it's not for me? And when I did stop and pray about it, I started to feel, well, actually, maybe this is something that's for me. And as I think you mentioned earlier on, I do think it's an important thing that Christians shouldn't shy away from that kind of public engagement and picking up positions in public life. I don't think that people should be standing on a Christian ticket as such. And I don't expect people to vote for me because I'm a Christian. I expect, or I would like people to vote for me because of other abilities or experience that I might have. And the fact that I'm a Christian is, for me, is the thing that gives me the strength and courage to do it and to speak out when I need to speak out. But as well, I want to drive home the point to people that, we're always being told as Christians, oh, Christians have no, you have no place here. You should leave your Christianity at the door. If there's going to be a debate about something that's perceived as a moral or a social issue, Christians should declare an interest, or they should leave their Christianity at the door. And I think it's important that we engage. We don't shy away from engaging in public life, so that people can understand that that's not how Christianity works. It should be woven through everything that you do. Your whole life is shot through with your Christianity, and it isn't a removable accessory. So that's a long-winded answer to what seemed like a straightforward question. But everything that I do, what I'm basically trying to say is everything that I do in terms of the blog, in terms of the trust, is informed by my faith. But more than that, my faith is what gives me the compulsion to do it and the strength to do it. Because there are times it's been a challenge, but it's my faith that, well, it's the Lord that carries me through. It's not my faith that carries me through. It's the Lord that carries me through.
I think we were chatting at the weekend, weren't we? And I was saying, I would actually disagree with you. I think there's actually lots of Christians who engage in public life, but I don't think there's many Christians who have a thought through, constructive Christian worldview about what they're doing. I see it particularly in social media. People share posts that are just very, very angry, and just attacking people who aren't Christians. And I think I was saying to you the other day, there's a very good article by Dan Walker, the broadcaster, who was saying, he quotes, I think it's Martin Luther, who says, the Christian shoemaker could put crosses on his shoes, or he could make excellent shoes. And for me, Dan Walker was making the point he's trying to be an excellent journalist, and that's part of his Christian witness. And I've always felt that as a social worker, and I've always felt that as a blogger. My job is to be excellent at these things, and to help other people to try and create this coherent Christian worldview about engagement.
Yeah, I would agree with that, actually, what you're saying. When I was talking about public engagement, I suppose I meant in a more formal way, as in people shying away from standing for election. But if you take social media into that, then yes, I have lots of friends who share posts and who'll write their own opinion on things, and sometimes not in the most winsome way. And I know it's driven, but it's driven from a good place. They're sort of driven to share their experience or their point of view on something, but you have to think about the audience as well and how that's going to be received. And if it's not done in a loving way, then it's counterproductive. It's worse than if you hadn't posted at all. So I think that's what needs thinking about. It's not just getting loads of labourers out there, but it's equipping, making sure that those people are equipped for that kind of engagement, and that they do it in a way that best reflects the Lord, that whose glory they're trying to show forth. You don't show forth his glory by being objectionable and prescriptive and wagging your finger at people, which I know that's territory I've certainly strayed into myself in the past, and it's territory that I'm very keen to avoid in the future.
But the reality is that most issues are complex, and that's one of the reasons why I started blogging, is to write comprehensively on complex issues, um, and which is why there's such a limit to things like Facebook, because Facebook tries to make things binary, or the whole media tries to make things binary, when they're actually very, very complex.
That's true. Yeah, it's a polarizing thing, and it drives people, it entrenches people. No matter what their good motive to start out with is, they end up just standing on their opinion in a way that's, there's no ebb and flow of discussion. I think that's right.
And how long have you been blogging now?
Um, that is a really good question. I think it must be, if I professed faith 5 years ago, then I think I must have been blogging for about 4. I think it was about a year after that I really started blogging in earnest. And it's tailed off a little bit. It's funny, you mentioned about me being prolific. Yes, I certainly went through a very prolific phase, which I knew wasn't going to be sustainable. But I just thought, well, go with it. If you're feeling the urge to write, just do it. I haven't written anything for a good few weeks now. That's because I've been occupied with other things, and I think as well it's quite hard. That's one of the challenges, definitely, of lockdown. I found it hard to be maybe quite as inspired, because the things that I normally draw my inspiration from, some of them just aren't there at the moment. I'm not out amongst people as much, and yes, I have conversations, but it tends to be with the same people. And I'm not saying that they're not inspiring, but you can't always be going to the same well for your inspiration. And even the news cycles are sort of depressingly samey. Everything comes back to COVID, and I don't want to write yet another COVID-related blog. So I'm just trying to be relaxed about it, and it'll come when it comes. There's nothing worse than trying to force something.
No, I'm the same. I went for a period. You and I have both experienced a lot of grief, and I went through a period last year of about 6 months where I just couldn't write. And it's come back to me in the last couple of months. I've written 4 or 5 articles, and for me, lockdown it's not so much inspired me, but to me, there's lots of issues that have come up, which is why I've started podcasting, because I think it's fascinating how the church has responded to lockdown. I think it's fascinating how leaders have responded to lockdown, which is why I'm doing this series of podcasts. I'm doing, reaching out to prisoners in lockdown. We did a very good podcast the other day with a church planter. How do you church plant in lockdown? So a lot of issues have come up for me, which is why we're trying to explore them. So, just moving on to about 6 years ago, you lost your husband, Donnie. Can you just tell us? I know it's a painful experience, but can you take us back to that time, and just talk about Donnie's illness a wee bit? And I know that he was spent some time in the local hospice, and just how his death affected you.
Yeah, Johnny first took ill in 2013. He was diagnosed with bowel cancer in late 2013, and initially given a really very sunny prognosis. He had a resection almost, I can't remember, it was really quickly. It was within a week of being diagnosed. And when they did the histology that they have to do and established that it definitely had been cancer, they also established that they'd removed it all. And so he was given at that time an 80% chance of no recurrence. And he had a course of chemotherapy anyway. He was 50 at that time and fit and healthy. And they said to him, you might as well take the chemotherapy just as a belt and braces because you're fit enough to cope with it, and it's an insurance policy. So he went through that, and it was difficult, but it wasn't as grueling as I know it can be. And by the beginning of 2014, his wound from his operation had healed. He'd gone over, he'd had the chemo, and he went back to work in August of that year. And almost immediately wasn't feeling very well again. And in the November of 2014, so a year after his original diagnosis, he ended up back in hospital, and they realised that the cancer was back and it had spread. He had spots on his liver, and the original site as well of the cancer. And then the prognosis was obviously not so good, and they were talking in terms of a few years. But they said if the chemotherapy that we're going to give him works, then who knows, the parameters will change. But he actually died. You can't say suddenly when somebody's receiving treatment, and it's sort of semi-expected, but we certainly didn't expect it to be so rapid. He died in March of 2015. So that was just under a year and a half from his original diagnosis. And what happened was he was having chemotherapy, and after every single session he was very, very ill. I think after every session he actually ended up in hospital. And that latest one, he had a chest infection. So they took him to hospital, and he was in hospital for a few days. They scanned him, and initially they told us that the tumour had shrunk quite a bit. So they felt the chemotherapy, although it was hard on him, it seemed to be doing its job. And then the very next day, I got a phone call from the hospital asking me to come in. And I was told then that he had grown really very ill during the night. They'd had a conversation with him about his options, and there was a very sort of a flimsy, if you like, option that they could fly him to Inverness and perform quite comprehensive surgery on him. But they said there was a strong risk that he wouldn't actually survive the journey. Or they said the other alternative is that we do nothing more, and we move you to the hospice. We make you comfortable and just let the illness take its course, obviously, with control, with drugs and pain relief. And that was his preferred option. But he said, I have to wait till my wife comes in and we'll discuss it. And if someone had said to me before that, in the abstract, you're going to have this conversation with your husband, I think I would have said, well, I won't agree to that. I would have begged him to at least try the other option. But as soon as he said it to me, I just knew it was that feeling of he's had enough. I think I've had enough. I think we know that this is the end of the road. And it's like something outside of yourself actually tells you that it's protecting you almost from what your own natural instinct would be, which is, let's try let's exhaust all the avenues. So I agreed immediately. I said, no, that's what he wants. That's the right thing. And within the hour, the ambulance had come to the hospital, moved him. I went with him, obviously, moved him to the hospice. And he was in the hospice for exactly a week. He was taken there on a Friday. And the Macmillan nurse who spoke to me, who had been with us throughout the journey, she said to me, do you have any questions? And I said, well, how long? And she said, I don't know. She said, nobody can answer that. But she said, probably days, but not days and days. And it turned out it was exactly a week. And he passed away very peacefully in the hospice. And I spent the whole week with him in the hospice. So, if that hadn't been there, the way Lewis used to be before the Bethesda hospice was open, the options would have been for him to remain in the hospital environment, which is, nice and all, as the local hospital here is, and kind though they are, and they do absolutely everything they can. And they were wonderful while he was there. that was one option. The other option would be home. And some people think when they hear that, they think, well, that's where I would rather be. I would rather pass away in my own home. But we had discussed this with the Macmillan nurse probably a few months before. I think when he was maybe diagnosed second time round. And she had pointed out, she said, if that time comes, she said, remember, home can sometimes not feel like home when you fill it up with a hospital bed and all the sort of equipment that has to go with that, and strangers in and out. You've got nurses and doctors in and out constantly. And then when the inevitable happens and all that goes away, does your home ever feel like home again? You know, she was saying you have to consider, and it's a hard thing to hear, because it's so practical and it feels so coldly practical to be thinking about that, and even to be thinking about what would I feel afterwards. I mean, you don't want to think about afterwards, but it was brilliant advice, because the hospice couldn't have been better. And then at least home really was a refuge when I eventually had to return home on my own. It still felt like home. So it's something I would always say to people in that position. You might think in the abstract, I want to die in my own home, or I want my spouse or my parent or whatever it is to die in their own home. Think about what that really means, because terminal illness changes everything, and it changes home by its very presence as well. So, you know, we were really well advised. That's one of the things I have to say about it. We were, in one sense, we didn't expect his death to come when it did and so quickly. But in another sense, we had been really well prepared for it too.
Yeah, I would agree with you in terms of hospice care. With my sister went into hospice in Paisley. I'd never walked over the threshold of a hospice. I don't think. Possibly visited, maybe visited Bethesda, but I was amazed at the care and the happiness of my sister's last 10 days. Actually, there was a lot of happiness. There was a lot of peace, and we were able to share a lot of moments together, which we probably wouldn't have if she'd gone back home.
Yeah,
So
you think, don't you think in the abstract, again, a bit of hospice, and I remember the nurse saying this to me beforehand. So you think of it as a depressing place, and you think, oh, it's just such an awful word, and the connotations connected with it, because it relates very often to terminal illness. But as you say, I found it to be a really positive experience. It sounds, to anyone outside of the situation, it might sound crazy, but Donny's last week was made as, I mean, definitely far more comfortable and far more, from the physical side of things, but also the emotional and the psychological side of things as well. I think it was if there is such a thing as a good death, that was a good death, and that's the advice I would give anyone else finding themselves in the situation is, don't dismiss hospice care, because it is not the cold, depressing thing that you might think it is. It's very far from that.
no, I mean my sister's case, they allowed her to bring her two dogs in, and I quite often talk about this, but there was just she died on Sunday, but the Friday before she died, I was out with one of her dogs, and an ice cream van came round, and I got a couple of ice creams, and we enjoyed an ice cream together, and it was just a beautiful moment, just
Yeah, yeah,
and then just after that she deteriorated quite badly. Um, so you and I have chatted about grief quite extensively over the years. We've both written about it quite extensively. Um, I, for the first time, ran an online grief group over the winter with others who had lost loved ones. One particular woman who'd lost a child to a drug overdose. So grief is a very individual journey. Can you just talk a wee bit about, the stages that you've been through with grief, and um, how you how you deal with grief now, 6 years on?
Yeah, it's true. That is true. I mean, I know it's kind of become a cliche. People saying grief is a journey, but it's a cliche for a reason. It's actually it's a truth. And you hear so much, you get so much advice when you're at the start of that journey, but nothing's that helpful because, as you say, it's so individual, and you're going to experience it in your own way. And the important thing is to let yourself experience it, I think. And possibly now, looking back from my almost 6 year vantage point, I would say one of the mistakes I made was to actually fill my life with too much distraction. I think one of the things I was afraid of, and I don't know if this is a female thing or not, um, looking after Donny had taken up so much of my time, not when he was well, but in the last sort of year and a half. Just the effort that goes into caring for the person and just almost willing them to get better and to stay alive. Um, and then suddenly that's gone. And I was concerned, I think, that there was going to be this huge void in my life, that I would be lonely, that I would be bored, and I needed to fill it with activity. So I did do that. So I think maybe in the beginning, I maybe didn't give myself enough time to be by myself. Although, I did have a fair amount of that, and work was really good. I got good extended compassionate leave, and all of that was made as easy as they possibly could for me. But I think the initial stage of grief um, is it's a little bit like shock, I suppose. And I had a little warning. I knew it was coming, um, but then when you find yourself in that situation, it's almost like you've landed on another planet, and you've got some of the equipment that you need, but not all of it.
Mm.
And you don't know what equipment you don't have because you don't yet know what you're going to need. I do remember in the beginning, my first most overriding thought. Funnily enough, I said this to a friend last night. We were just talking about this for some reason, and I said, my first thought was actually, I wish I wasn't so young, because Donny Donny was 51 when he died. I was 39, and I just thought all I could see ahead of me was just potentially, not being presumptuous, of course, none of us knows how long we've got, but I was just seeing potentially years and years and years of feeling like that. Now, that's how you feel initially, because of course you think you're going to feel that way forever. You don't. Your grief changes. So to begin with, I felt very probably weak and lost and vulnerable. And it's only when I look back now I realise at the time I thought I was doing quite well. And I was doing quite well because I didn't allow myself to wallow and things like that. And I went out amongst people pretty quickly. I went back to church within a fortnight, that kind of thing. But when I look back now, as I am and as I feel now, I realise how much stronger I am now in myself than I was then. And that's when you realise you are actually in a really vulnerable position when you're first bereaved, because you don't even realise. It's like a layer of skin or something has been stripped off you, and you
Mm.
don't realise how exposed you are to everything, because you're concentrating so hard on just getting by. But yeah, it changes as you know yourself. Grief changes, and um, I've gone through probably all the usual stages. The only thing I can honestly hand on heart say is I didn't feel anger. A friend of mine who's a psychologist asked me quite soon after, um, had I felt angry, and I said no. I was quite bewildered by his question, really, because I was thinking, well, who would I be angry at? Donny put everything he could into trying to get better. I knew I had supported him as much as I could. I certainly can't question the care services, because I know they put everything into it. So there was no one to be angry at, and I don't understand that. Um, and his attitude was always, why not me? It happens to people. Why should I be exempt? And so I didn't have that sort of feeling of this is unfair. But then, I put that down to my faith, because that gives you a perspective that nothing else can. Um, so and that's just grown. It's grown my faith. That's I have to say that this, for me, is a really practical lesson in what the Bible tells us, that yes, you will go through fiery trials, and God's not going to protect you just because you're one of his own. He's certainly not going to protect you. Quite the opposite. I think sometimes he exposes his own to the things that are going to hone us and shape us. And that's how I've experienced this. And that's why it's been possible to get through it in something like being intact at the end of it. It's not because of me. It's not because of the way I've handled it. It's because I've chosen to experience it by leaning on him. And that's what's shaped my grief journey for me most of all.
I think the thing I would say about grief is that, my sister was in hospital before she went to the hospice, and the hospital experience was quite difficult for lots of reasons. But I remember for about 7 nights coming back from Glasgow to Livingston and crying quite, openly in the car. And in many ways, I felt like I grieved that week, and I felt when she actually died that I'd actually grieved quite a lot, And the grief is still a process, but I felt like I'd done some of my grieving already.
I think so. I think when I would echo that as well. I think because I knew, and it was like you almost lose the person by degrees, or you let them go by degrees, because you're processing your grief as well. And first of all, it hits you like a huge, overwhelming, I don't know how I'm going to cope. And then you realize you cope with it like you cope with everything else. You don't cope with it all at once. You get used to it. You take it day by day, moment by moment. And, as you're saying, by the time they actually pass away, you're I don't know if the word is right, if the word ready is the right word, but you're prepared, I think. And that's probably what you were experiencing there too.
I think one of two things I would say is, one is I never understood, I never grasped how physical grief is. It's a very, very physical thing. And, 6 months after losing my sister, I lost my dad. And the week after my dad died, I was physically very, very unwell. And I think a lot of people thought it was the start of COVID, but, looking back, it could have actually just been physical exhaustion. I was just completely floored. And I've said to lots of people since, don't underestimate the physical impact of grief in
Absolutely.
terms of tiredness. And like you're saying, don't overdo it. But the second thing for me is, I said this to somebody who'd lost their wife recently. I was saying, everybody tries to be so helpful, and everyone says they're praying for you, and everyone sends you lovely cards and letters, and everyone says you want to meet up for a coffee. And for a long time, and probably even now, my grief was largely solitary. I wanted to be on my own, and I have grieved largely on my own. And that's just the way I've dealt with it. I go for long walks. I think it all through. I write, but meeting up with lots of people and having coffees with them was not the way that I found, you know, or expressing my grief. It may well be for some people, but my grief was very much was quite a solitary thing. I felt.
Yeah, I think if I'm honest, that's probably how I was too. I would do the meeting up thing, but that was more as a distraction from my grief. And I wasn't talking about it. I was probably talking about anything but to people. Um, and yeah, no, I think I processed it mostly on my own, but I'm actually, contrary to popular belief, I'm quite an introverted person anyway. And to me, that's just normal. And to me, it's in one sense, it's quite a private thing, how you deal with it and how you process it. But then I felt after that, as I sort of realized where I was in terms of my faith as well, I thought, well, it's part of God's providence for me, but God's providence for me isn't just for me. So while I might process it and experience it and go through the sort of the ugly side of grief, if you like, in private, I want to share the fruits of that journey with other people in the hope that it might somehow be useful to them. Like talking about it with you just now is one thing. I probably wouldn't have done it at the time, and I wouldn't have been able maybe to do it at the time. It was probably too raw. And I think distance gives you perspective as well on a situation like that. And you know, and as I say, just being stronger generally to talk about it. So yeah, I think grief for me it was quite a private thing. I didn't. I'm sure a lot of people wondered at how little emotion I did show publicly. I didn't cry at the funeral or anything like that. But a lot of that is, well, it's partly cultural, I suppose, and partly I think if I'd started, I wouldn't have been able to stop. So it was important for me as well to have people around me, and part of that was try and be easy to be around. I used to say this to myself: if you're going to be a misery to be around, people won't want to be around you. They're soon going to melt away, and you do need your friends around you. So try and not make this, just a mire of misery for everybody. That actually helped me. It's slightly along the lines of, I hate the phrase, but that whole fake it till you make it was partly my philosophy. Not pretending that I was fine and that it didn't matter, but just not constantly wallowing in it while I would be with other people. And then, as you're saying, on my own, yes, thinking things through and allowing myself to think about it. Because it's not healthy to dismiss it from your mind either and always push it away because you can't. It's going to surface somehow.
I think we made quite a deliberate attempt, though, that our grief was fairly public, and one of the great challenges of lockdown, of course, has been the fact that you can't have funeral services, and my sister's funeral was amazing, uplifting, encouraging, beautiful. You know, there's 400 people there from all walks of life, and it was a tremendous worship service. But just my sister had such a huge impact, so it was a beautiful thing to be part of, and I'm a great believer in um, the boys were at the graveside. I wanted them to be there. It was just family at the graveside, and then the service was afterwards. But I'm a great believer that I think the way that funerals are done in Lewis is good. That there's a community grief, there's an outpouring of grief, and in many ways that's helpful. And the way in which many funerals are done in the mainland and in the cities is very, very clinical, and I don't think it helps people to grieve properly.
No,
But
I think that's been hard on people in Lewis as well. The fact that COVID has robbed them to an extent of that. I mean, it has everywhere, but in a place where the community was so important as part of the process, it's really difficult for people now to do things in this new way, and they've kind of slightly lost a level of support there.
the other thing I was going to say is that I wanted to write very openly about my grief, and also I've made a film about it, which is been seen by about 2,500 people, and I wanted to, I was given the whole promise of or the Book of Ruth when I was starting this whole process, and the whole thing about I think I told you this, somebody from Lewis. I was listening to a sermon and they were talking about Ruth, and they were saying, how did Ruth come to faith in the living God? And it was through the witness of how Naomi grieved over her husband and sons, and that really struck me that grief in itself can be a witness, and how we respond as Christians to grief can be a huge witness. And I kept that. I very much kept that when my sister and my dad died.
Yeah, I think that's actually a very good point to carry away from any discussion about grief as Christians, is that it's a branch of witness, or it's an opportunity for witness, both the way a Christian handles their own grief and how we are to other people who are grieving, whether they're Christians or not Christians, it doesn't matter, but how Christians react to other people's grief, and this idea of being alongside them in their grief. I think that is important.
And um, I always ask people at the moment just how you've coped with lockdown yourself, how things have adapted for you during lockdown.
But from a practical point of view, it's been quite easy for me in terms of my work. My work was the kind of thing that adapted really well, because anyone who knows anything about the University of the Highlands and Islands, it was kind of at least 50% online, if not more so anyway. So it just meant switching to working from home for me, and those students that I would normally see face to face in a classroom, I see them on the far end of a camera, just like we're doing right now. Um, and it's been, so that's the practical side of it's been fine. And even here in deepest, darkest Ulster, we have great internet, and that side of it is not an issue. What I have missed from my working life point of view is um, just the experience of being in the office with the rest of the team. And when you are part of a team, teamwork is that little bit harder when you're having to have your meetings and everything planned. There's nothing ad hoc really, and there's none of those nice wee sort of, the water cooler chats, the wee creative ideas that might spring up just while we're sitting having out coffee, and suddenly we've got a new course idea or something like that. So I miss that. I miss the banter. We have a really good, close working team, and we've worked together for years. And um, that side of things, I do miss. But practically, yeah, the work is fine. Other things, obviously, the big issue on a lot of people's minds was worship, and how do you carry on public worship under these kind of circumstances. I have found that my Sundays have become what I really think a Sunday should be. And I've realised that my Sundays were not what a Sunday should be before. I think I was aware of it anyway. But Sundays for me were frantic, because in order to be at the morning service and the evening service, it's a 20-minute drive. I like to be early for things, so that meant, no long lie on a Sunday, and I have pets that I have to take care of before I go off. And then
Well,
after the morning service, I would be shooting off to Sunday school, and then
the minister
lunch.
preaches for quite a long time as well, doesn't he?
The minister, yeah, he does go on a bit. He can do, but it's all relevant. It's like I always say to my students, we won't penalise you for going over the word count if it's not padding. So it's the same thing we'll say to him. Yeah. So then, and I would do Sunday school after the morning service. I'd have to walk the dog and everything. It was just rush, rush, rush. And I found myself finally in a position where after the evening service, or during the evening service even, I would be praying that nobody would ask me to their house after the evening service, because I was so tired, because I'd had a week of madness, and then Sunday was equally frantic. Now I have a Sunday that is what it should be. It's focused on resting in the Lord, being able to spend time in the morning with my Bible, spend time in prayer. Then I have the morning worship is also from here, and the day is just focused on time with the Lord, and on regenerating, recharging the batteries for the week ahead. I've actually found that lockdown has brought me closer to Him, because one of the big things I can say about loneliness, because of course I live alone if you don't count the dog and two cats, um, and people will sometimes say, do you not get lonely? Long winter nights, and especially during lockdown. I can hand on heart say that I have never been lonely. I'm not lonely, and I don't feel like I'm alone, because, and it's a sort of, I'm a horribly cynical person, and probably if I heard this from someone else, I might be thinking, oh, that sounds like a nice thing to say, but is it really true? It is really true. I am so aware of the Lord's presence in my home, and of course more so the more time you spend actually in prayer and in reading and in contemplating Him, the more aware of that you become. And this kind of solitude that I've had, where I'm able to be in the house or I'm out walking my dog, I'm just so conscious of his presence. And it's been, for me, it has been an enormous blessing. I can't enthuse about it enough. I'm one of those people who probably I'm viewing the possibly imminent end of this way of life as being not necessarily entirely positive, because the lockdown for me, I'm fortunate. I mean, I'm aware, of course, it's been devastating for some people, and I hope I'm not coming across as callous in that respect. But it affects different people in different ways, and the way it's affected me, it's been positive. It forced me to stop rushing about and never being at home, and it forced me into a position where I have things in their, I feel like I have things in their proper place. And instead of some mornings I would be praying in the car driving to work, and that wasn't right. That was me fitting the Lord, squeezing him into the wee pockets of time that were left around everything else. Now I feel like he's getting his proper place, more so, not perfectly, of course, more so, and everything else slots around that, which is as it should. And the benefit to me has been enormous spiritual benefit and enormous mental benefit, and I think actually physical benefit as well.
No, I'd agree with you. My Sunday mornings are a wonderful cup of coffee and able to read properly. And um, people might find it hard to believe, but it's quite a challenge getting 5 boys out of bed for a Sunday morning service.
Can't
So.
see that.
Well, four now. One is with his grandparents and is able to go on Facebook Live. So just finishing off, Catriona, it's been great chatting to you, but we always ask our guests on Ragged Theology podcast what their favourite book of the Bible is. What would your favourite book of the Bible be?
It's a difficult one, and I think on different days I would probably give you a different answer. Probably, and a lot of people probably say this, but I think, can I have one from the old and one from the new? I think the Book of Psalms has got to be, certainly in my top 5, because it's got something for you in all the seasons of your life. It's a comfort, it's a challenge. It can surprise you. So yeah, the Book of Psalms, I would say, but on other days I would have to say the Gospel of John, because it's just beautiful, and it is the life of Christ. It's the way it's focused on the life of Christ and the way it brings him so. For me, of all the Gospels, it's the one that really brings him most before you as what he is, as the living God. Not saying that the other Gospels don't do that, but for me, this is the one that most speaks to me. So I'm cheating slightly, I know, but those would be my 2, one from each of the Testament.
I'm using a different Bible reading plan this year, and it takes you to random Psalms that are connected to the passage in the Old Testament. So the other day I was reading Psalm 28, and I was very impacted by it. And one of my guests that came on the podcast, I said, "Have you got a favourite passage?" And he said, "Yeah, it's Psalm 28." And it was the same day as well. I couldn't believe it. So
that's interesting. I think for me it's Psalm 27, but I mean, that, like I say, on different days it would probably be different ones. They're just, it's amazing how they do speak to you in every situation.
And maybe we'll do another podcast, but I'll ask you next time what your favourite presenter is. I know you'll have your top 3, but
is that presenter with a C or a podcast presenter? Presenter as in singers.
I know you got some lovely presenters in Stornoway. So
we have some crackers, but the best thing of all is when the minister presents.
he's not bad, is he?
He's a talented guy. Yes, it's good. Ably backed up on backing vocals by.
I'll make sure I have a chat with his wife about making sure you don't get invited in for a fellowship on Sunday nights, just so you're not too stressed out.
Oh yes, it wouldn't do at all. They always add to my stress, those people.
So it's been great chatting to you, Catriona.
You too.
You've been an inspiration to me over the years with your blogging and your writing.
Likewise.
You write very bravely. It's not easy to write vulnerably like you do sometimes, particularly about grief, and it's been an inspiration to read you over the years. And I know from talking to many, many people that you have touched a lot of people's lives through your writing. So please continue to do that and continue to write bravely and vulnerably about your faith and about your grief, because it has helped so many people. So,
Thank you.
but thank you for coming on, and I'll let you get back to walking Mr. Roy along
Yes.
those golden sands of Trivor.
He is fidgeting somewhat in the next room. I can hear him. So yes, that's
Great.
great. Thank you, Andy.
Well, thanks for coming on Ragged Theology Podcast.
Thank you.